So in the previous video, I released a piece of software called Studio Server Client. This particular piece of software enabled you to basically have a dedicated DaVinci Resolve Project Server running on a Linux virtual machine or bare metal server. I said in that video that if I got quite a lot of interest and feedback was good, etc., then I would probably iterate upon that and build out a web panel. So today, I'm super excited to demonstrate to you a new web interface management panel for Studio Server. Hello guys, welcome back to another episode of Bear Tech. Well, I've got some news. So if you've seen my previous video where I actually have developed a native DaVinci Resolve Project Server that runs on Linux, obviously that previously was only provided as a CLI tool, so a command line interface tool where you could SSH into your server, run some commands, set up project databases, handled all the backups, etc. I did actually say in that video that if I got enough feedback and people were interested, they'll actually iterate upon that project. So the feedback has been great, and I'll cover some more of that feedback later on in this video. But I just wanted to say that I've actually now released a new piece of software called Studio Server. So to simplify the deployment and installation of this system, on this piece of software, so it's actually distributed and deployed as a Docker container. Some of the comments did mention that people were worried about installing third-party pieces of software on their servers. And whilst I will just quickly add that I did expect most people to install it as a dedicated virtual machine, I appreciate that, maybe they don't want to do that. But now, as it's running as a Docker container, it's completely isolated. We'll go through the very simple steps in just a few minutes as to how we can deploy this onto a server or a virtual machine or a network attached storage device using Docker. And then more excitingly, I'll then walk you through how we can actually access a web-based administration panel where we can then create project libraries, configure backups, restore backups, reset passwords, etc. It's now super easy to do. You no longer have to SSH into servers or anything like that and run commands manually. The web interface, in my opinion, intuitive, and I'm just really excited to show you. So if you're interested in this, you want to run a DaVinci Resolve Project Server for your team, or maybe just for your team to collaborate, or maybe you just want a central server like I do, where I know that I can just be working on projects. We can configure backup schedules, and the server can automatically back up in the background, and we can literally one-click restore these projects. Then this video is probably definitely for you. As I mentioned in the previous video, I originally built the software because DaVinci Resolve don't actually provide an official Linux server for DaVinci Resolve, and I particularly like to have a central location where I can actually access, for example, projects on this machine, and then I can go and use my laptop somewhere else without having to copy across files. The main thing here is that Studio Server is now released as a Docker container, firstly, so that means that we can very easily change the storage locations of where backups are saved. It also means that the setup and installation is far simplified, and from the comments it will basically please those people who were worried about installing third-party pieces of software on their servers because Docker containers are isolated. So that's pretty cool. And equally, for all those other users that had issues installing it on different distributions of Linux. In theory, there's no reason why you also couldn't deploy this Docker container to a Windows server if you wanted to. It still obviously runs the Linux container, but just on the Windows operating system. If you've got an M1 or M series or Apple Silicon range of Apple Macs, in theory, you could also run Docker on there and therefore deploy Studio Server onto your Mac. So very cool. By far one of the greatest features of this piece of software though, in my opinion, is the fact that you've now just got a web management panel. So you can actually access it from anywhere on the network, and you can log into it, you can manage your project libraries, take manual backups, restore backups manually, you can configure backup schedules. In addition to that, based on some feedback from another user, I've actually now added the ability for you guys to configure and script out pre and post backups hooks. So that means that once a backup is started or a backup has completed, you can actually use some predefined variables and you can go and trigger things such as if this then that, or you can go and kick off, say, a webhook to go and hit an API somewhere. So literally the possibilities here are endless. You can even go and, for example, once those backups have been taken locally or to an NFS share, which again was another feature that was requested, the hook script can then go and move those backup files to somewhere else, or equally trigger off a cloud backup. Some users wanted the ability to back up to, say, OneDrive or GoogleDrive, etc., etc. The awesome thing about with Docker containers is, and we'll cover this in the video, is that you can actually mount the backups directory now to a specific directory on the host of your server or NAS, which means that if you're deploying this to a machine that has OneDrive installed or Google Drive, you can actually mount that backups directory to a subdirectory inside OneDrive or Google Drive. And then when those backups are actually created, they'll go directly to there. So the container will create the backups, send them to that directory, and then the file watcher behind the scenes on OneDrive or Google Drive will then automatically back that up to your cloud provider. Again, very, very cool. And you know, this is a massive improvement on the previous CLI version, although that has already had like hundreds of users already, which is really, really impressive, really cool. I'm really happy with that. And the feedback, like I say, guys, has been absolutely great. So thanks for sending me the emails. Obviously, some of the comments you popped in the comment section on that previous video. Again, I'll link a link to the previous video because I'm sure it might be helpful to some of you other users who are now watching this one. But yeah, so anyway, I'm probably talking way too much already, so we're going to jump into it now. But first of all, you just need to make sure that you've got some kind of machine that has Docker installed. So Docker is a prerequisite here. Other than that, that's pretty much it. You just need Docker installed. And if you don't have Docker installed and you still want to, you know, test this out, try it out, then wait till the end of the video where I actually then do a very quick tutorial on how to install Docker on a Ubuntu 22.04 server. And then once you've watched that part, you can then come back to the start of the video and basically watch from the start, and then that will then take you through how to deploy the container and then configure your admin account and then access and use some of the features from the web panel. But anyway, without further ado, let's just jump straight into it. Per the website, we're just going to scroll down and we can see installation. From the documentation here, the simplest way to install and set up the Studio Server software on your server. First, ensure that Docker is installed. Using the standard Docker CLI, you can run the following command. So obviously at this point, just take note of this. So what this message here is basically saying is that with this example that I've used below, it actually does use the Europe London. So for me, obviously that is correct. However, you may need to change that for your country or your location. There is a full set of the official time zone names online. Obviously just go and Google like your time zone in this particular format. So it's generally America, and then say for example Chicago, so it'd be America/Chicago, or Europe, Lisbon, etc. So whilst I won't personally need to change this for my installation, you may obviously need to take note of this and change it for your own requirements. The other thing we mentions here is that there's 4 persistent volumes, and those 4 persistent volumes in this example will map to the current working directory. So pwd, in case you didn't know, this $pwd in bash is actually a variable. So we're actually going to hard code these volumes. And it's particularly important here for Studio Server because these volumes exist so that the container can talk to the actual file system on either the host server, or say for example you could also mount an NFS share to a remote server or any other sort of remote file system. But we'll hard code these to some specific directories that we'll create on our server so that when we restart Docker in future, the data that is written and managed by Studio Server in these 4 directories is persisted. So this, for example, means that future upgrades to the container, so when I release new versions of this software, that you can simply pull the latest image and then basically upgrade the container and you'll get the latest version of the software whilst all of your data remains intact. So now let's go and set up a few directories where we're actually going to store that data on our host system. So for the purposes of this video, I'm going to create 4 directories on this server. I'm just going to create them at the root level. Obviously you can follow the Unix file system philosophy if you like. You could stick them under the /opt or the /var directory. However, to keep things simple, I'm just going to create the directories at the root in a new folder or a new directory called data. So here I'm going to type in sudo mkdir /data, and if we just lsal the root directory, we can now see this new data directory here. So I'm going to change into the data directory, so cd /data. So let's just now create 4 directories. So now if we bring the site back, we're going to see what they are. So ideally one called hooks, database, backups and jobs. So let's minimize that. Okay, dir database. We want database backups, jobs, and hooks. So now we've created each of those directories. Let's just bring the website back up again, and we're just going to copy this this command here, and we'll just come back to our terminal. I'm just going to paste it. So first we're going to change the mount point for the jobs directory. So we're going to remove the $pwd, and we're going to type in /data, and we'll keep jobs. And then we'll remove pwd there as well, and we're going to go data, and again for the database, and finally the hooks, so /data. So as I mentioned, we're going to keep the time zone as Europe London. A few other things which are actually described on this website here, so it does mention all the different options that we're using and what exactly they're used for. As an example, it's recommended when we're actually creating these mount points or the passing these volumes through, is that there are certain volumes which are ideally suited to different types of storage. So for example, the database mount point is hosting the data for Postgres, so ideally that wants to be hosted on an SSD or an NVMe drive. So these are considerations that you may want to take into account if you're, for example, deploying this container to UnRAID, whereby UnRAID generally has an app data mount point, which is generally stored or recommended to be stored on an SSD drive. It would be ideal to mount this database directory to a directory on that fast drive, whereas the backups directory is actually used for automated backups of the main database and the Studio Server configurations. So now that we've explicitly mounted those directories to the 4 volume mounts, just remember, obviously I mentioned that for your particular requirements, you probably want to change this time zone variable here to match your current location. If you fail to do that, as per the website, it does say that the environmental variable TZ should match your geographical location. If this doesn't match your host server or NAS's time zone, there may be inconsistencies in how backup timestamps are displayed within the web interface. So just pay attention to that. So now at this point, we can literally just press enter here, and it's now going to pull the container from Docker Hub and then start it. So just give that a few seconds. Okay, and assuming you see the same as what we're seeing here, that should now be started. We can of course check that and validate it by typing in docker ps. So that's going to show us all of the running Docker containers, and as you can see, we've got this Docker container called Studio Server running here. So next up, what we want to do is you actually want to navigate to localhost 8543, as mentioned in the website just here. So once the container image has been pulled and the container is started, it will automatically configure itself for first use. And so give it a few seconds before navigating to the web-based administration panel to finalize the configuration. Set up an admin account, basically. So to do this, we're going to use a browser, the IP address of our virtual machine or our NAS device, essentially just the server that Docker is running on, and then we're going to specifically use this port here, so 8543. So as if by magic, I've already pulled up a tab here, and if we press enter here, we're now actually being presented with this configure your server sort of entry page. So here we can actually change the username if we want. Admin is literally just a recommended default. However, if you're security conscious, you may want to change that. I'm assuming that obviously most hackers would probably try admin, root, and other such accounts. But anyway, so you can keep it as admin if you want, or of course you can change it to whatever you want. But in this instance, and for the purposes of the video, I'm just going to keep it as admin. And then we're going to type in a new password here, so we can make it whatever we want. And then just make sure that it obviously matches on the second line. Finally, we're just going to click done, and that's it. We're now taken to the Studio Server dashboard, where it's giving us an overview of our server. As you can see, we haven't actually got any project libraries created as yet. We've got the option to create one up here. It's giving us some storage information. So this particular virtual machine is only provisioned with a 20 gigabyte partition. The reason why we've actually got both database and backup available storage sizes is because in an ideal setup, what you'll probably have is you'll have the actual database mounted to the local VM or to some fast storage. And then you've got the option obviously to mount the backups directory to, for example, remote NFS storage or another location on your server, which is ideally parity protected. So some kind of RAID array, because the way that Studio Server works is that you can very quickly, if say for example, the worst case scenario is that the container becomes corrupted, we can actually just spin up the container again, use the same volume mount points, and then we can actually recreate the project library with using the same name. And then assuming you're still actually mounting the volume to the actual backups directory, we can literally one-click restore the project library back, and then you're back in business. So yeah, this is just giving us an overview of what sort of storage we've got available to us. Again, we've just got some version information, so you can obviously easily keep an eye on what current version you're running, and if you want to go and check for any updates on the website or anything like that, then obviously you've got a reference point here. So we've got a few other little tabs. We can drop this default admin down and edit the account. This is where you can of course change your password if you want. And we can set an actual name here, so we can say Joe Blogs, and we can just say joe@example.com and save changes. And there you go, you can see that the account details have been updated successfully. So anyway, let's just quickly head back to the dashboard. So let's go and create our first project library now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this create new, and I'm going to give it a name. So let's just call it example_project. And you can either give it a specific password, or you can use this generate a random password. To be honest, it's entirely up to you. There's actually two methods which you can use to connect to the actual Studio Server in DaVinci Resolve. You can actually manually connect to it, or you can actually download a connection file, which is what I'm going to demonstrate to you shortly. So I'm actually just going to click this generate a random password. That will pre-populate both of these fields, and then we can click on create. Give it a few seconds, and there you go, that's the first project library. We've got a few options here. We can now go and check what backups there are, and as you can see, we're getting a warning here saying that we've not actually set up any automated backups. That gives us the option to do so, and there are a few other options down here. But for now, let's just quickly go back to the dashboard where we can explore the rest of the features. So to actually connect to this project library, we can actually normally click this little button here, which enables us to download a DaVinci Resolve connection file, which when double clicked, it'll pre-configure their DaVinci Resolve software to enable it to connect to the server. At the moment, it's actually giving us a message saying you need to first of all configure an access IP. So let's just click on this button first of all, and it's going to actually take us to the configuration settings. So configuration settings can normally also be accessed from this tab up here, but we need to specify the IP address of the server. So this is essentially going to be the same IP address that you would normally SSH into the server or the virtual machine. Or obviously if you're deploying this to a network attached storage device, it'll be that IP address. So I'm just going to type in 172.25.87.60, which is obviously the IP address that I've been using earlier on. So saving changes, just go back to the dashboard now. And as you can see, this button has now changed to this green color. And clicking on this button will actually download this file, which you can then email to colleagues, or obviously stick on a shared network drive somewhere. So once the file's downloaded, it'll appear like so. And this file will work on Windows, Mac, and Linux machines. And then to simply automatically configure DaVinci Resolve, all we have to do is either double click on the file, or we can actually open DaVinci Resolve Studio itself and then drag it in. So from the network tab, you may or may not see a left-hand navigation panel. If you've never used network servers before with DaVinci Resolve, this is probably collapsed. Click on this little button here, and then that will expand that panel. So we're going to take the file that we downloaded and simply drag it across. I'm just going to drop it here. I'll give it a few seconds, and it will automatically connect to the database. Let's now click on this, and as you can see, it's now empty, and we're ready to create our first project. And as you've probably got local projects on DaVinci Resolve, you can actually export these and then re-import them onto the network server. So heading back over to the project server, we can add as many project libraries as we want. So whilst you may be tempted to create a single project library for, say, a particular client, or maybe your company, and maybe some personal family videos, etc., just bear in mind that backups and restores are handled at the project library level. So if you create a single project library and drag in lots of projects that are being worked on by lots of people, if you had to restore back, you would essentially overwrite all of their changes. So you need to probably choose a workflow that works best for you. So let's now just go and explore the other features. So heading back over to the Studio Server Management panel, let's just go and create another project, and we'll call this test. The more project libraries you add, they just get added to this list, and then you can independently manage them. Again, you can now click the connect button to download the connection configuration information for this particular project library. But what we can do is let's now go and explore the manage backups feature. So from this screen, we've got various different options. We can take a manual backup of the database, so we can do that now. We're just going to click on backup now, and whilst that's running the backup, you're just going to have this little animation, and then shortly we're going to see the new backup. And as you can see, it's telling us how big the backup is. It's saying it was generated 5 seconds ago. If we were to refresh this page now, you can see 16 seconds ago. And obviously it goes without saying that that will just increase as time goes by. It's very simple to restore a project from a backup. We can literally click this restore button. When you clicked, it'll actually ask you to confirm. Much like when you reset a password, if you're going to restore a database, any users that are currently connected to that DaVinci Resolve project library will be disconnected. So they'll have to, again, reconnect to the project library or close DaVinci Resolve and reconnect. If they want to reconnect to the project library, they can just go File, Project Manager, and then literally just come off the current project and then click back on it, and then it will reconnect. Probably goes without saying that when you restore this, it will overwrite whatever is currently in there with the contents of the backup at the point that it was taken. So just be a bit careful with this particular feature. Let's explore some of the other features. So to satisfy this particular warning message, it's basically telling us that we don't have an automatic schedule set up for this particular project library. However, we can click here, or we can use this button here to go and configure automatic backups. So we have a few presets that are available. You can choose daily at midnight, for example. So if you were previously using the CLI version of the client, that would default to a daily at midnight if you use the automatic nightly schedule feature. However, you can use every hour, 3 hours, etc., etc. Additionally, you can set up a custom schedule. Whilst it's a bit extreme, we could actually specify we want it backed up every 5 minutes. So in this example, the cron expression for that would be */5 space ******. And as soon as it gets a valid configuration, it translates the cron expression to a human readable form. So it's saying it's going to back it up automatically every 5 minutes. So I'm just going to save that now. Saving. And it's obviously just telling us that it's been automatically saved. If we refresh this page, you'll see now that that message has now gone, and it all looks good. So it's basically going to run a backup every 5 minutes. And as backups are run, they'll appear in this list. So now we've configured automatic backups, which I highly recommend you do. We also have another feature, which is pretty powerful. We can actually configure hooks. So by clicking on this, it takes us back to this configuration tab and highlights this section here. So you can actually use bash here to trigger, for example, webhooks to IFTTT. So if this, then that. We can use these variable examples. So $1 is going to give us the project library name. The $2 is the start type, and that's either going to be manual or auto. So obviously manual is if you were to go and manually run the backup either from the command line interface, which you can access through the Docker terminal or console, or auto if the Studio Server software itself is running your automatic schedules. It'll output auto. In addition to that, the third variable here will actually give us the backup archive name. So the combination of these three variables here, you could very easily script out, say for example, a webhook and pass in the different variables into like a JSON string. Anyway, that's more of an advanced feature. Probably shouldn't go into it too in depth here, but suffice to say it's there for those people who who want extra control, and maybe they want to send a notification, Discord notification, or something when a backup has started or has finished. So yeah, so back onto the project library screen again. We've now covered obviously the backups. We've got a couple of other options under advanced. So under advanced, we can actually reset the database password. So this is handy if, say for example, you're working with a few colleagues and one becomes disgruntled and leaves the business, but maybe you're accessing your studio server over a VPN, and maybe they still have access to the studio server. Using the reset password option, we can basically generate a new password, and which means that if the user tries to access any of the project libraries when the password has been changed, obviously they're going to get access is denied from inside the DaVinci Resolve Studio software. Just obviously bear in mind that once you reset the password, if I just show you now, so for example, if I just type a manual password in here and hit reset, once that has been reset, you will not be able to access it in DaVinci Resolve unless you reconfigure your DaVinci Resolve client. And then next up, we've got the ability to actually delete the project library. So anyway, guys, that is the end of this part of the demonstration. I'd highly recommend you just go away, install it, play around with it. You know, I've demonstrated the main features here. Obviously, I can't really have this video going on forever, although I definitely could talk forever. But yeah, so go away, have a play with it. If you've got any issues, you know, go and visit the website. Links will be in the video description below, or, you know, comment here, send me an email. It's cool. You know, I'll get back to you all. Maybe even if it's just a few days, a few weeks, I will come back to you all on that. But and if you're interested in how to install Docker on Ubuntu, then obviously, you know, you can hang around for this part as well, but there really is no need. So if you are about to leave now, I just want to say thank you ever so much for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing. And if you're into this sort of content, DaVinci Resolve, Linux, etc., then I've definitely got some more content coming very, very soon. So thanks ever so much, guys, and I'll see you around. So if you're still here, that's great. Thanks ever so much for sticking around. Let's now go and take a look at how to install Docker on Ubuntu Server 2204. If you don't already have a virtual machine set up, you'll need to go and grab one of those. There'll be a link in the video description below if you want to test it out on, say, DigitalOcean. Otherwise, spin up your virtual machine first and then follow along with me in the next part. Now that we're actually logged into our virtual machine or our bare metal server, what we want to do is, first of all, we want to as per Docker's official documentation, we want to make sure that we remove any old versions of the software. So we can do that by typing in sudo apt-get remove docker engine docker.io containerd and run C. So that's absolutely fine. We couldn't obviously find Docker engine. Clearly that's not obviously installed on this server, so that's fine. So we can clear that. So next up, we want to update our system packages. So we're going to type in sudo apt update. So that will just pull down the latest package information. Next up, we want to install a few dependencies. So I'm just going to quickly just paste in this command. It's going to save me typing it. And as you can see, so we're going to install CA certificates, curl, GNU-PG and LSB release. So we'll install those now, and perfect. Okay, next up we're going to add Docker's official GPG keys. So I'm going to paste in these commands. So I'm just going to create a folder under etc apt keyrings if it doesn't already exist, and then we're going to download the GPG key from download.docker.com. And so we'll press enter here. That's done. And then next up, we want to actually add the Docker repository. So again, I'm just going to paste in this command, and all of the commands I'll put in the video description below. So it will just be a copy and paste exercise for you as well. But we'll just press enter here, and that's done. And next up, now that we've added the official Docker repository, we now want to re-update our package cache. So sudo apt-get update. As you can see, it's now pulling package information from download.docker.com as well, which is perfect. So at this stage, we can now install Docker and its various components. So again, we're going to type in sudo apt install dockerce, dockerc CLI, containerd.io, docker buildx plugin, docker compose plugin. To be fair, A couple of these last two here aren't really required, but as per the official Docker documentation, it's probably worth us installing it anyway. So we'll just press enter here, and we'll accept what it's going to install. And so we're just going to press Y and press enter. And after a few seconds, that should all be done. And that's fine, we can just click OK here. You may or may not get this. Obviously there's a new kernel for me at this particular point in time. If you do get this, just press enter here and that'll clear the message. And then we should be taken back to our terminal prompt. Right, next up, if you've ever used Docker as a standard Linux user, you'll probably notice that some of the commands in the past you had to run a sudo. However, we don't want to do that. We want to add our current user to the Docker group. So we're going to type in sudo usermod add g, so add to this group, and then we're going to type in Docker as the group name, and then we're going to type in $user. So this $user here, this basically just means our currently logged in user, and as you can tell from this prompt here, my username on this virtual machine is ballen, so it's going to basically add my user to this Docker group. So press enter there, and then finally we're just going to quickly add new group, type in Docker. Right, so now to verify that it's all been installed, let's just type in Docker version. Perfect. So as you can see, we've got the Docker engine 23.0.1 installed, API version 1.4, and various other community Docker version information provided here. So that's great. So now what we can do is we can actually go and check the current status of the service. So we can type in sudo systemctl status Docker, and hopefully that's running, which it is, so active running. So now we've verified that that's actually running. What we want to do is we want to make sure that in future when we reboot this server or this virtual machine, that it automatically starts back up. So we're going to just make sure that it's enabled. So we're going to type in sudo systemctl space enable Docker. Okay, so that's now done. Perfect. So at this point, let's just quickly restart this VM. So we're going to type in here sudo reboot. So give it a few seconds, and then once the virtual machine has rebooted, or the bare metal server if that's what you've chosen to use, is restarted, we should then be able to log back into it. So I'm just going to SSH my username at the IP address of my VM, 87.60, and then I'm just going to log back into it. Perfect. So at this point, we just make sure that the Docker is still running. So sudo systemctl status Docker. Perfect. Okay guys, so that's the end of the video. Really appreciate it if you made it this far. I mean, woo, that's a long video. But yeah, great. Thank you ever so much for your support. Really hope you enjoyed it. If you've got any comments, you know where to put them in the comment section below. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you're really excited about this.